we talk about Trump catalyzing voters, but Biden, the election of Joe Biden, catalyzed Republicans here, right? I mean, I would hear stuff from neighbors about, banal stuff about the IRS hiring more employees. Oh, that means that IRS agents are going to bust down my door and take me to jail because I've been cheating on my taxes. I mean, I heard that stuff all the time.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Alfred Soto, a writer, educator, and native of Florida, who also happens to be one of our board members here at the Progressive South. During my visit to Miami last month, Alfred and I sat down to talk about the political evolution of the Sunshine State. Once a fiercely contested swing state, Florida has swung sharply into red territory over the past decade. Alfred walks us through how that happened and what it might take to turn the tide. That's coming up later in the episode. Also, in our arts and culture segment, we'll talk about the desecration of a memorial in Orlando. But first, it's time for the news roundup, Back to School edition. Students across the South have returned to classrooms this month for the start of the new academic year, so it's a good time to consider the impact of a relatively new feature on the landscape, school vouchers. After decades of resistance to the idea from Democrats and Republicans alike, vouchers have made major gains in recent years, mostly in red states. They got a big boost during the first Trump administration when voucher proponent Betsy DeVos served as Secretary of Education. Vouchers can take different forms, but their core idea is providing public funding to families to pay for education outside the bounds of regular public schools. In recent years, they have most often presented as what are called education savings accounts, or ESAs. Basically, the state provides a set amount of money per child per year, and parents can use it to help pay tuition at private schools, including religious schools. Although different states restrict the programs in different ways, several have moved toward what are called universal ESAs, available to all K-12 aged children without family income limitations. Some states also allow the money to be used by homeschooling families to cover education-related expenses. The growth in these programs has been dramatic over the past decade. According to the pro-voucher nonprofit organization EdChoice, the number of students in some form of voucher or ESA program in the United States has grown from about 103,000 in 2015 to about 838,000 this year. That's still a tiny portion of the estimated 55 million school-aged children in the country, just about 1.5%. But the numbers will almost certainly continue to grow as more states broaden their voucher programs. According to EdChoice, 35 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico now have some form of voucher provision. The most expansive ones are in Republican-dominated states, and not surprisingly, they include most of the southern states: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. The exceptions in the South are the blue-leaning Virginia and the somewhat maverick Kentucky, which is an interesting case. Kentucky's Republican legislature tried to create a voucher program, but it was blocked because of wording in the state constitution that allows funding of only public schools. And when the legislature put a referendum on the ballot last year to change the state constitution to allow vouchers, it was soundly rejected. On the same day that 64% of Kentucky voters cast their ballots for Trump for president, 65% of them voted against school vouchers. The measure lost in every one of the state's 120 counties. It was a different story just south of Kentucky's border, in Tennessee, where Governor Bill Lee this year finally achieved a goal of universal vouchers that he has been pursuing since he was first elected in 2018. The Tennessee program is limited to 20,000 students in its first year, which is this year, starting now, with half of those spots reserved for students from lower-income families. But both of those caps go away starting in the second year, and participation will be limited only by how much money the legislature is willing to put into it. The Tennessee program provides vouchers, or as the state calls them, education freedom scholarships, of $7,295 to families to pay tuition at private schools. An analysis published by the education news website Chalkbeat last week found that that is actually slightly more than the state's average per-pupil spending for students in public schools, which is about $7,023. The Texas legislature also passed a voucher bill this year, creating a program set to take effect in 2026. It will provide about $10,000 a year to students who enroll, and it's expected to cost $1 billion in its first 2 years. It gives priority to students with disabilities and to lower-income families, but up to 20% of the vouchers could go to the state's wealthiest residents. Florida created a voucher program in 2019 and lifted income restrictions on it in 2023. This school year, it is estimated that it will cost the state about $4 billion. Most of that money is going to private schools, but Florida's program is also available to homeschoolers, and some homeschooling families are using the funds for educational outings like trips to Walt Disney World. WESH-TV News in Orlando found that 8,400 students had theme park tickets reimbursed by the program in the past year. All of this gets at the question of who school vouchers are really for and who is most likely to use them. For years, the rhetoric from voucher advocates revolved around the promise of providing choice to students who were, quote, trapped in failing public schools. The argument was that kids from lower-income families, especially students in urban schools, especially black students, didn't have the same options that wealthier families had to move to better schools or school districts. So vouchers have been proffered as kind of an equalizer, at least theoretically. There have always been problems with this framing. The first and most obvious one is that the trope of failing schools is just not an accurate way to talk about public schools that primarily serve students from lower-income families. There are strong and consistent correlations between academic performance and socioeconomic status across all schools, regardless of their facilities or teachers or curriculums. It's not that good or great teachers and principals can't make a difference. They surely can. But cumulative scores on standardized tests and other metrics at any given school will primarily reflect the socioeconomics of its population. Those schools are, for the most part, not failing. Their students and teachers are confronting a daily matrix of struggles and needs that just don't exist to the same degree in schools with higher socioeconomic demographics. Also, in most school districts in 2025, especially larger urban districts, it's not true that students are trapped in any given school. Many districts have magnet schools that any student can apply to, as well as transfer policies that allow students to move between schools. There's also been a growth in charter schools across the country, which provide another publicly funded option. Charter schools, of course, have their own detractors and issues that I won't get into here, but they are still subject to most of the same requirements as traditional public schools, including state tests and the provision of special education services. So, in most public school districts, there already are various forms of school choice. Then there's the gap between how much most of these vouchers pay and how much it costs to attend private schools. In Tennessee, according to Private School Review, the average annual tuition at private elementary schools is about $13,500, and high schools are $1,000 more. That's double the state's school voucher amount. The numbers are similar in Texas, so even that state's $10,000 vouchers would leave families thousands of dollars short, a huge hurdle for the low-income households that voucher supporters like to talk about. But of course, for families who are already managing to afford to send their children to private schools, vouchers will be essentially free money, a big taxpayer-funded rebate. That's why it's not surprising that in states like Indiana, Iowa, and Arizona that have pioneered universal vouchers, data shows that many of the beneficiaries are affluent families with students already in private schools. In Arkansas, 95% of the students using the state's Education Freedom Account vouchers in the 2023-24 school year had never attended a public school. Perhaps in recognition of this reality, many conservative lawmakers have shifted their rhetoric to a broader framing of choice and freedom. As Tennessee rolls out its universal program this school year, officials have learned from the states that have gone before them. They're not even collecting or reporting data on whether voucher recipients previously attended public schools, presumably to avoid giving ammunition to their critics. In fact, voucher states are being stingy about collecting any data at all on the students in private schools receiving vouchers. The schools, in most cases, remain exempt from administering state tests required of all public schools, along with state curriculum requirements, special education regulations, or most of the other myriad rules and metrics heaped on top of their public counterparts. It is useful in the context of this school voucher rush to consider the origins of the concept. It is generally credited to the libertarian economist Milton Friedman, a major figure in modern conservative thought. He proposed a voucher system in a 1955 essay called The Role of Government in Public Education. He said vouchers would promote freedom of choice rather than the public monopoly of government-run schools. That essay, of course, came out the year after the Supreme Court's ruling in the Brown v. the Board of Education case, which found racial segregation in schools unconstitutional. So you can imagine who was the most receptive audience for Friedman's idea at the time. White families horrified at the prospect of sending their children to school alongside black children. Friedman, who opposed state-mandated segregation, recognized this appeal, but saw it as a benefit. If nobody was forced to go to any particular school, he reasoned, then there couldn't really be such a thing as segregation. He wrote, quote, "Privately conducted schools can resolve the dilemma. They make unnecessary either choice. Under such a system, there can develop exclusively white schools, exclusively colored schools, and mixed schools. Parents can choose which to send their children to." Unquote. 70 years after he wrote his essay, that dream is effectively becoming reality in many southern states. Okay, now we're to my conversation with Alfred Soto. Alfred is one of the board members of the Progressive South, and I'm very grateful to him for his assistance with this project. I've known him for close to 20 years, but in a very 21st century way. We're both regular contributors to an online forum that has discussions that range across politics, art, music, film, and much more besides. We've actually only met in person twice, once at a music festival in Chicago and the second time last month during my visit to Miami, where he's an associate teaching professor in the School of Communication and a student media advisor at Florida International University. He writes and has written for a number of publications, including the Miami Herald, Pitchfork, Billboard, Stereo Gum, and Spin. And he's secretary for the FIU chapter of the United Faculty of Florida, the state's higher education union. Alfred's smart, observant, and politically engaged in one of the South's largest and most complicated states. So I really wanted to hear his thoughts on what exactly has happened there over the last few decades, as the once politically competitive state has turned increasingly and deeply red. As I expected, he had a lot of interesting things to say. We actually continued this conversation well beyond the confines of this interview over dinner and drinks, but I didn't bring the recorder along. I think what's here gives a good grounding, though. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. And I am so happy to be here in Miami to talk with Alfred Soto. How are you doing, Alfred?
Hey, Jesse, good to see you.
You too. I've been here in your city for a couple of days, and it's a pretty fascinating place. I'm still trying to get my head around it.
Yeah, it's having lived here all these decades, there's still layers to this I'm still trying to figure out. So if you're trying to do this in 4 days or whatever, good luck.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to make a return, which, I mean, honestly, there's worse things to do than to come down to Miami. But I wanted to talk to you about, because you're not only immersed here in Miami, but in Florida. You are one of the most politically astute people I know in the universe of people I know who write and talk about politics. And we will have links in the show notes to Alfred's blog, Humanizing the Vacuum, where he writes a lot about movies and music, which is excellent and you should check out, but also a lot of observations, commentary on news and politics. And you do write a lot about Florida there. Florida is obviously a really interesting and weird state. We were talking about it a little bit before we started recording. And, you know, I think the obvious big picture question that people ask about Florida these days is what happened to it. Because, you know, I certainly grew up, most of my political awareness sort of from the 1980s into the 2010s, Florida was a politically diverse state. It had both Democrats and Republicans as governors and senators. It was won in presidential elections by both Democrats and Republicans. And just in the Trump era, essentially, it has taken what looks to be a really sharp red right turn. What is your perception of that as somebody who lives here and is politically active and aware? What has happened?
I'm reminded of that line about that Scott Fitzgerald once said about how crack-ups happen. It's gradually and then suddenly. Yeah, because your preface is correct. So for most of the 80s, we had a Democratic governor. His name was Bob Graham, who eventually became a U.S. senator and on a couple of presidents' vice presidential candidate lists, namely Clinton and Al Gore's. And I think he was Al Gore's number 2 after Joe Lieberman. And then we had a one-term Republican governor, Bob Martinez, after which we had 8 years of Lawton Chiles, another former senator, but he flipped it, senator turned governor. And he died in office as Jeb Bush went up against him for a second time, and this time Jeb Bush wins. And his lieutenant governor, Buddy McKay, is governor for about 6 days. So then Jeb Bush in 98 till 2000, if I'm not mistaken, 2006, I believe, was really the first modern Republican governor of Florida. And by our standards now, Jeb Bush looks fairly benign, but context matters, right? At the time, he was also seen as the nerdier Bush brother, right? The one on whom the Bush clan had put all their hopes, the smart one, the smart Bush, right? And I think George H.W. and Barbara Bush were notably upset when he didn't win governor the first time, and George W. did win in Texas in 94. So what's most memorable about Jeb Bush now, it's something little discussed, but it has ripple effects constantly through our politics, especially our educational system. He was one of the national leaders on charter schools. He pushed hard on creating governing charters for these schools and carving out benefits at the end of the year in our budgets, our fiscal years for these things. And they started out modestly, and now they've just exploded the last 9-10 years. I mean, my nieces go to a charter school, and some are better than others, but it depends on what you think of them as institutions in the first place. They are, in essence, public schools being paid for by our money, and they exclude other students. You know, for instance, there's this infamous charter school company called Academica, and they've created a number of schools across the state. And one of their mandates when they opened one of their schools here was to make it more racially diverse. And they built that school in a predominantly black part of town. There's something like 3 students in a class of 90 who are of color. So that's Jeb Bush's legacy, right? Otherwise,
I just want to jump in there because that legacy extends outside Florida. I know in Tennessee and in a lot of southern states, Jeb Bush's whole charter and pro-voucher enterprise has been really influential. And in Tennessee, our current education commissioner actually came from Jeb Bush's organization. So, yeah, he really has been. We talk a lot about Betsy DeVos being the kind of, fountain of all of this stuff, but Jeb Bush is really important in pushing for both charters and vouchers.
And it's important to note it's bipartisan, right? Because during the Obama administration, he had a number of people under him who vouched for, pun intended, for the academic liberty and the flexibility. That's in quote and scare quotes. That these schools offered, right? So it's and you can connect the rise and the good health of charter schools to NIMBYism, right? Because who doesn't, liberal or conservative, want to deny their child a good education? How you define education, of course, is fungible, right? So otherwise, Jeb Bush was, for example, during national disaster, as a pretty good steward, right? He took climate change seriously. I remember him in the 2000s. We had a number of devastating hurricanes. We got Wilma in 2005, and Katrina brushed through us on its way to New Orleans, and he was there and visible and compassionate in ways you don't expect from Republicans these days, or even compared to his brother who was in New Orleans at the same time we were having these storms. So he leaves office, and then we have Charlie Crist as governor for one term, and he was seen as a fairly liberal Republican for Florida, and a bit of an opportunist, and you can smell it on him, right? There was, and that's ultimately what undid him, because he had no natural charm or constituency. He just blew with the wind. So ultimately, when his luck ran out, he became a Democrat. And he served 2 terms as a congressman in the Tampa, St. Petersburg area before, there's no other word for it, a pathetic attempt to challenge DeSantis for governor, and that, well, look how that panned out. So then after Charlie Crist, we got really the ancestor to DeSantis. We had Rick Scott. Rick Scott, who barely won his 2 terms as governor, I mean, by a percentage point, really accelerated a lot of Jeb Bush's policies. He was the first governor, for instance, in this kind of attempt at gleeful malice. He published the salaries of state employees. And you could say, well, that's a public record. Yes, of course it is. But the point is, it was to shame. You see what these people are making on your dime. Right, and he instituted, and this is how it affects public education, on the public university system. He instituted a metric system, whereby, and there's no other way to put this, universities would steal from Peter to give to Paul. So universities had metrics to hit on 4-year graduation, matriculation in certain STEM courses, and so forth. And if you met the expectations, you were basically given the money you were supposed to get. If you fell below these expectations, money got taken out of your budget. And if you exceeded them, you got other state universities' money. So what did that do? Well, UF, FSU, our flagship schools, did the best. And then lower performing schools like UNF in Jacksonville or Florida AMU got a little less, in some cases penalized. My university, Florida National University, has done fairly well, and the last couple of terms has been at the top of those metrics. So you can call it another version of means-based education. It's certainly accelerated. I shouldn't say accelerated, but it's been gradual. This turn and emphasis towards STEM education, because that's where the emphasis was, right? So departments that were regarded as less profitable, less apt to help our standing in these metrics were not funded as properly.
Right. It's hard to have firm metrics for your philosophy.
Correct. Yeah, and religion, for instance, or for modern languages. So we had 8 years of Rick Scott, and then he leaves he's term limited, and he runs for Senate in 2018, and also barely wins his race. And then a congressman known to those who are devoted Fox News watchers named Ron DeSantis. Basically, I'm not sure what he did as congressman except live in a Fox green room for the second Obama term, basically. And he was the classic Republican loudmouth, indistinguishable from hundreds of others. And he runs for governor in 2018 against the mayor of Tallahassee, Andrew Gillum. And it was for a while close, and then suddenly in the fall, as we approached Election Day, Gillum looked like he opened a pretty substantial lead against DeSantis. And he had a number of great moments and debates. There was this one great zinger that if you were watching the debates at the time really stood out. At one point, Andrew Gillum turns to the camera and says, "I'm not saying that Ron DeSantis is racist, it's that racists think that Ron DeSantis is racist." And DeSantis was just caught completely flat-footed by the remark. And we all thought, wow, he's got this, right?
And Gillum would have been the first black governor.
First black governor, and our first Democratic governor since the mid 90s, right? And that was a real sense of optimism. Because remember, that was the year of the very successful Democratic midterms, right? When the Democrats took back the House, right? And several local races around the country flipped blue. It was his wave, right? It didn't happen in Florida, right? We had Rick Scott won his Senate race, and Andrew Gillum barely, I should say DeSantis won, but really he barely lost. Gillum barely lost. I mean, so it was something like a quarter of, I mean, you can correct me, it's something like a quarter of a percentage point, something like that, something ridiculous. And that's really, if you want to look at where the tidal wave of red in developing our state begins, it's 2018, right? Because we were the anomaly, right? I think even in Texas, right? Beto O'Rourke, he gave Ted Cruz a genuine scare, and I think he lost by 3 points,
right?
Yeah. So Florida was not happening in Florida, right? And we were optimistic because Hillary, when she ran for president in 2016, here in Miami-Dade County, she won by 26 points. And in Hialeah, the city just north of us, known as this industrial city and one of probably the most Latino community in the United States, right? She won handily in Hialeah, right? And Hialeah has the highest number of Obamacare enrollees in the country. That's an official statistic, right? And so Hillary loses, fine. 18 was a blow. And then DeSantis, his first year, as we were talking off mic, actually was not bad, or I should say not as terrible as we expected. He said some conciliatory things. He made an effort to work with the large Democratic minority. And he signed a couple of Everglades bills that, by all accounts, were substantive efforts to claw back some of the region from industrials, from Big Sugar and so forth. But then March 2020 happens. COVID hits, and for the first 3 or 4 months he behaves. Our county behaved extraordinarily well during COVID. He allowed most of the counties, which tend to be blue with the big cities, to make their own policy, and he followed, right? But then in May 2020, there's this press conference with Trump where he starts touting, I should say gloating over, at the time, Florida's very low COVID infection rate. So he sees that as an excuse to say, well, that's it then. We had our 2 months of fun. Now we're going to start lifting some of our restrictions. And although he left local communities, municipalities to make decisions, statewide, it was a free-for-all. And for a while in July 2020, we had the highest COVID infection rates in the world. We were something like 15,000 cases a day in July.
Because everybody was coming down here.
Everybody was coming down.
COVID vacation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas, and I have to explain this to a lot of people, and this is one of the paradoxes you've seen in Miami, and we've talked about. I will go for the first 2 or 3 years of the pandemic, so way until 2022. I go to a supermarket and I would see seniors masked, right? And some of them with gloves, right? And then they would turn around and drive to the nearest polling station and vote for Republicans. So there was no real correlation between taking COVID seriously and voting for Republicans. It was seen as, well, Trump and the government are wrong on this one, because there's an old saying in Cuban Spanish: the only person you trust more than your parents is your doctor. So when your doctor says wear a mask and get vaccinated, you do it. So it just got worse from there, right? And then we talk about Trump catalyzing voters, but the election of Joe Biden catalyzed Republicans here, right? I mean, I would hear stuff from neighbors about, banal stuff about the IRS hiring more employees. Oh, that means that IRS agents are going to bust down my door and take me to jail because I've been cheating on my taxes. I mean, I heard that stuff all the time, right? Summer 21, spring 22, you go to a gas station, you would see stickers of Joe Biden saying, I did this, pointing to the high gas prices. And it's true, actually, inflation was much higher in Florida than the rest of the country, in part because so many damn people were moving here, right? Housing prices were just exploding. I mean, all you have to do is look at Miami Herald headlines 21, 22, and it was just off the charts. So yes, we did suffer from inflation more than anyone else, but it was self-inflicted, right?
And presumably a lot of those people who were moving were attracted by what they saw
Correct.
and heard from DeSantis, right?
Correct. And then you had the mayor of the city of Miami, Francis Suarez, very briefly a presidential candidate in 2023, 2024, you might remember. He was encouraging all the crypto bros to move down here. And there's a infamous photo of him on this bull somewhere in downtown Miami. He's astride the bull. And if you know what Francis looks like and you see him on the bull, I mean, it's one of those self-owned things. Like nobody on his team took him aside and said, "Boss, you shouldn't do this." So it was encouraging the so-called libertarians from Silicon Valley to move to Florida, and a lot of them did, right? And that started inexorably changing the politics here. So we went from plus 26 or plus 24 for Hillary in 16 to plus 7 Joe Biden in Miami-Dade County. So almost a 20-point difference. The 22 midterms were, once again, much better for Democrats than we thought nationally, but a disaster here, right? DeSantis went from barely winning in 18 to winning by, if I'm not mistaken, 12 to 14 points. No, 18, 19 points, excuse me, in his second term for governor. We lost several blue Congress people. And we had, for instance, our relatively good mayor of Miami-Dade County, Carlos Jimenez, who was, again, a pretty good steward during COVID, suddenly, once elected to Congress in 2020, one of the first things he does is vote against impeaching the ex-president Donald Trump. And this is a guy who openly voted for Hillary. He said so in 16, because that's when Trump had no chance. Trump was a madman and so forth and so on. But he did a hard pivot. And by then, most of us here as observers knew we had a lot of work to do. And maybe this is a nice segue. We were at that point from 2020 and 2022 getting the response from the state Democratic Party was starting to wane. I think they saw what was happening and maybe had no interest in pouring resources into what they saw was increasingly a lost cause. So we saw some pretty dire moves in 22 and especially in 24 from which we still haven't recovered.
Well, so the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the impact of that whole, the anti-woke crusade, which obviously has taken a lot of different forms here, but one of the most dramatic ones has been in higher education, where you work. And DeSantis has been very successful at placing his own people, mostly people with political credentials and not academic credentials, as presidents of public universities across Florida or as board members, really an aggressive ideological takeover of higher education, which, rhetorically, I think you hear that in a lot of places, certainly across the South. There's always railing against, the liberals and communists at the universities. But DeSantis is making it real at I think a greater level than anywhere else. What's that like as a faculty member, as somebody who's going to your job to teach, which is what the state is paying you to do, to have to do that in this environment now?
It's been a strange experience for me, because I was for many years an administrator before I was full-time faculty. I was one of the advisors for our student media at Florida National University. And then I worked part-time as an adjunct first in English and then in journalism, before I was hired as a visiting professor. I did that for 4 years, and hired as a full-time professor in 2022. So I become assistant professor just as the fun begins, right? And it took a while. It took about 18 months. And for example, we were always told, even back when I was an adjunct 10 years ago, that Tallahassee can request syllabi, right? But it started getting enforced in 2023. And you think, oh, okay, well, you started to laugh it off and think, well, what's some 26-year-old intern in a state office building paid $30,000 a year? What's he doing? Control effing for, woke stuff? Actually, I think that's what happened. So For instance, last year we were told that our syllabi have to if it's in the anything STEM related or even arts related, we have to mention the Western canon. So, for instance, I teach a couple of rhetoric courses, and I have to allude to it. And it's for me, it's rather redundant. It's redundant because my rhetoric class, one of them anyway, is a survey course from 400 BC to the modern era. So I call it from Plato to Trump in essence. So and all it does, in some ways to its detriment, is cover Western rhetoric, right? So I thought for a while, who cares? I put this in. And I thought, no, why should I put this in? F this. And I was getting requests from our union saying, don't give in, just don't do it. And many of us decided not to do it. However, last year, 2024, several of us were notified that our courses were downgraded from, let's say, a 3,000 to a 2,000 level, which every university is slightly different, but anyone who knows reference numbers for classes will know that anything 3,000 and up is upperclassmen, and 1 and 2,000 is lower division. So it didn't mean any loss of compensation or prestige, but it means suddenly that the class no longer appears as part of the core curriculum. And we weren't told why, but everyone understands why. It's woke, right? And I teach a film class too, and my film classes and it's right there in the syllabus. We will watch films by queer directors, by directors of color, and you will write about them. And the rhetoric and the film classes were downgraded. So I had to adjust the syllabus to reflect, because now it's a different kind of student taking the course. Right now, you're less apt to get a junior or senior than a freshman, sophomore, and it's a completely different level of.
And people are taking them as electives.
Exactly.
I guess, right? Yeah.
And it's a different level of university acclimation if you're a freshman, sophomore versus a junior or senior, right? And I can't give you an answer this is the first semester is going to take effect. So starting in August, I will know. But this happened across curricula. And then finally, we all learned in January that DeSantis had wanted our president, Ken Jessel, who had previously served as chief financial officer for the university. He became president after our former president had to step down over allegations of sexual misconduct. And Jessel, while not a visionary, was a pretty good steward. He'd been in the university for a while, since 2009, if I'm not mistaken. Good relations with the faculty, good relations with the union. So his departure was abrupt and came out of nowhere. And it became known that DeSantis, wanted his lieutenant governor, Jeanette Nunez, to serve as president. And because DeSantis appoints some of the members of the board of trustees, our governing body, we knew by February, when the BOT appointed her on an interim basis, that ship had sailed. It was an inevitability. It was going to happen. And there were token protests, some of them quite robust, but they weren't going to stop it. And she was officially installed as our president about 6-7 weeks ago. So now I should say that nothing has happened, right? But the very presence of a former cabinet member of DeSantis is its own kind of chilling effect.
Sure. It kind of erases the idea of the university as an independent organization, right, or as a non-political
right
arena where different thoughts and ideas can all be brought forth, right?
Right. And it's all happened during the summer when times are slow. So who knows what machinations are happening behind the curtains, right? And I'm not one to speculate, but who knows? So not right now. It's been quiet. We can't really say she has done X, Y, and Z because she's only been in office a few weeks. But we're all sort of waiting with our fingernails in our mouth to see what's going to happen come August.
Well, so I often try to end interviews, especially if we've been talking about things that seem sort of dire, by asking, well, what out there gives you hope? So I will ask you, whether it's in Miami and Florida more broadly, because you're you're active at the university, and you're active as a writer, and politically. Is there anything that you're seeing these days that you think, maybe there's something here we can build on?
Well, I mean, you know me a little bit, Jesse, from we've met once before, and you know me online for quite a few years. I'm not a person given to despair. That's just not constitutionally. I think too many people depend on me for me to, go into the slough of despond, right? So temperamentally, I can't do it. So I guess what gives me hope, I love what I do daily more and more. I didn't think that was possible. Most people become disillusioned or get bored of going to their jobs. I do not, right? I had a great class yesterday. I'm a 12-month contractor, so I teach during the summer. And I had this great face-to-face film class yesterday, and I left on a real, genuine high, right? I was just soaring, right? So that keeps me going. We have a really strong union presence at Florida National University, and in fact, I'm also the secretary for the chapter of United Faculty of Florida, and my term begins actually in August. And we got a pretty good collective bargaining agreement with then President Jessel and the Board of Trustees. It was approved without any real hitches last summer. So far, President Nunez has not indicated that she's going to do anything different, but that's what everybody is sort of waiting, is any kind of tea leaf watching to see what's going to happen. I have faith. I like cocktails. So, and also I should say that however red Florida's become, I'm not seeing a similar shift with the younger population, right? Obviously, my university and student government tends to be more conservative because unlike many other research one institutions, this one tends to attract people who stay in Miami. A lot of them still live at home. And cost of living being what it is, it's not a surprise given that people in their late 20s still live at home here, right? So what does that do? You're hearing the toxicity in your living room. They're watching Fox, listening to Cuban radio, right? They're watching, outrages on YouTube or on Instagram reels, right? So some of them are poisoned by it, but others, because I hear this all the time, they're just grossed out, right? But they can't leave. They're stuck in this. So they're the ones in despair, and those are the ones I want to watch out for, I want to take care of, because, like I said, I'm not seeing an reddening, let's put it that way, a reddening of the 18 to 30 set in South Florida, at least. But there is a sense of uncertainty, because where are you going to go, right? You need a certain kind of job to leave here. And so, but at the same time that they have ground down and become anti-Trump is a good thing. However, I'm not seeing pro-Democrat. That's the thing. Right. Their brand is just as gross as Republicans down here, right? And they're just seen as wimps. Yeah. Right? Republicans are evil, but at least they're forward about it, right? They're not hiding anything anymore. They're not being, benevolent Reagan with a smile and the burr in the voice and the wells. This is now pure toxicity, right? But Democrats offer nothing in return. Right. We, and I indict myself, we offer nothing in return, right? Except the repeating of platitudes that have long since lost any kind of resonance.
Those guys are bad.
Right.
Which people know, or some people know, but they're not, they're not hearing that.
Right.
The positive message or the energizing message or whatever.
And of course we need leaders, but we also we realize even as early as 2022, we need to fend for ourselves as Democrats, because the state party won't do it for us. So we're going to have to look at every victory at a time. Even last summer, for instance, we won a council seat in the city of Miami Springs, right? We're like, yay, and he comfortably won. And it's one of those things that, who cares about, the small municipality, but it's something, right? And if for decades Republicans they treated every sheriff's race as if it were a presidential race, why can't we do the same? That's how they have taken the majority, right? So that also gives me hope that eking out these small things when the bigger prizes elude us.
And I'm going to stay in Florida conceptually in the arts and culture segment, which is not a happy story. As you may have seen, last week the Florida Department of Transportation, under a mandate from the Trump administration, painted over a rainbow-colored crosswalk in Orlando. It had been installed as part of a memorial to the victims of the 2016 Pulse shooting, in which 49 people at a popular gay club were murdered. The state said the repainting was necessary to minimize distractions to drivers, although there's no evidence that that had been a problem. Trump's Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, sent a letter earlier this year to all 50 states saying that political statements of any kind should be removed from public roads. In a social media post, Duffy wrote, quote, "Taxpayers expect their dollars to fund safe streets, not rainbow crosswalks." The Orlando crosswalk is across a state route, so the state has the authority to repaint it as it wishes. Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer was shocked by the removal and called it, quote, "a callous action" and, quote, "a cruel political act." He added in a social media post, "We are devastated to learn that overnight the state painted over the Pulse Memorial crosswalk on Orange Avenue. But we know that while this crosswalk has been removed, Orlando's commitment to honoring the 49 can never be erased." Dyer said the city had worked carefully with the state to design and install the crosswalk, and that it met all safety codes and requirements. In fact, the same State Department of Transportation that painted over it had installed it in the first place. And Dyer said the colors on the road actually enhanced the safety of the pedestrian crossing because it stood out more to drivers. On last week's episode, we talked about the restoration of Confederate monuments and memorials. This is the inverse of that impulse, one of many memorials to members of racial and cultural minorities that the Trump administration has ordered erased. I wanted to mention it partly because it's such a self-indulgent act of cruelty, serving no purpose except to denigrate members of a community that was devastated by a mass murder less than a decade ago. It illustrates again the sheer bullying behind so many of this administration's actions, punishing people they don't like just because they can. I also wanted to mention it in the context of my conversation with Alfred. He wrote one of the best things I read in the aftermath of the Pulse shootings, and I want to call it to your attention. It's an essay titled "Only When I'm Dancing Can I Feel This Free: Queer Liberation, Dreams, and Self-Discovery on the Dance Floor." Alfred wrote it for MTV News, which, like most good things about MTV, no longer exists, but you can find it on the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive, and I've put a link in the show notes. In it, Alfred talks about the centrality of dance and music to both gay and Latin American culture, and the sense of freedom and belonging they can provide. I highly recommend reading it. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. You can also write me at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. We'll talk to you soon.